for certain, yes, for certain topics or themes, you could have controversial opinions, what we call literary critique or criticism. It's okay to read about different opinions, but I wish to see your own thinking. It's okay. But avoid just to copy and paste from the internet. No, yes, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, yes, bravo. This is good to change it, to use your own words. And by the way, it's okay if your opinion is different from what you read. The good thing is, in poetry in particular, every interpretation is respected. Every paraphrasing is okay, because this is how you felt. Sometimes when you read a poem, you think it is talking about a little girl, but other people might think it is talking about a country. Somebody else, no, it is talking about the poet's mom or mother or whatever. It's okay, because everybody interprets poetry in a different way, and this is how you felt it. It's okay. There is, to be honest, there is a video that I would like to share with you, because it is taken from the mouth of a poet herself, is asking you or giving you tips. I would like to share it with you, and just give me a second. Share with the sound. Here we go. Let's see it and discuss quickly afterwards.
Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I will be talking all about poetry. I will be giving you 5 tips to help you understand poetry. I always get asked by so many people who are slightly intimidated by poetry where to start, so we'll just be talking all about that today. My apologies if you hear the wind outside, it's going crazy, but we'll just get right into the video. Let's just start off with the basics. What is poetry? This topic, this question is highly debated. I highly suggest that you watch a video. I'll have it linked. It's a TED Talk about just pondering what is poetry. It's a 5-minute video. It's super short, but I think it'll just help you have a better understanding of what is poetry, as well as how poetry imitates or presents itself in our everyday life. With that being said, let's get into the tips. My first tip for understanding poetry is to just go in with an open mind. You will not know everything about a poetry collection, about a poem right off the bat, and that's okay. I have been reading poetry since I was very little, and I still come across poets to this day that I do not understand. I feel like a lot of people don't read poetry because they have this fear, which is very well rationalized, of not understanding. You may go into a poem or a poetry collection and think that you should understand every single message that the poet is trying to convey, which is ultimately the goal when reading, but it's okay if you don't know everything. So let's get into tip number 2, and that tip is to start small. And here is where the phenomenon of modern poetry, IG poetry, Tumblr poetry, celebrity poetry, very, very helpful and almost integral to the art form, because yes, there are some modern poetry that just isn't the best, but there's also some really great poets out there who write poetry super accessible. But start small. Start with poetry that is accessible, especially if you are a beginner with poetry. I think that poetry and reading is a muscle. The more you practice and read it, the stronger your understanding and comprehension becomes. That's how I think you should approach poetry as a newbie, as a novice. You may not understand everything, but I can guarantee you that you will understand a majority of what is trying to be said. The metaphors are not usually over complex. You won't run into like jargon or super complicated vocabulary words that tend to happen in more advanced or literary poetry. Because something is more simple does not mean it is not as profound. The next tip that I have for you is to read like a poet. Speaking as a poet myself, I find that when I go into reading more complicated or more advanced poetry, I am thinking in a way that is different than if I were reading a nonfiction or fiction book. When you're reading nonfiction and fiction, your mind is just, I don't want to say you're reading at a surface level, but you kind of in a way you are reading through the words and you are not actually going into the words. I don't know if I'm making any sense. Whereas for poetry, you have to put yourself in the mind of a poet. Here's where you're gonna have to like kind of just refresh yourself with literary devices and techniques that is commonly used in poetry. So poetry has a certain musicality to it, and this musicality is achieved through rhyme, rhythm, and meter. And then you also just want to refresh yourself on basic understanding of what a metaphor is, what imagery is, and what motifs are, because these are super important literary devices when reading poetry. And usually as a poet, our job as storytellers is to use images that are common or that may seem like everyday occurrences, and then further flesh out those images and experiences and feelings into telling a story with as few words as possible. So that's the thing. Poetry is just basically a story, but without all of the unnecessary details, without all of the long explanations within the story. It's like the bones, it's the skull, it's the skeleton of storytelling. And the flowery language and the use of language is the meat and the muscle and the tendons that set it in motion, set the story in motion. And to start looking for those devices within the poem and see how they are aiding the story that's being told. Do this is just to pay attention to who's speaking in the poem, what they're talking about, and the emotions that you get while reading the poem. If you aren't a poet, it's okay. I think doing the first two tips will help you get into the mindset of what to look for while reading poetry in order to further understand it. So my next tip, once you start reading like a poet, then we're gonna get into reading actively while you're reading poetry. Now, what does it mean to read actively? I mean to annotate the heck out of a poem. Do not be afraid to underline, circle, write it out in the margins. Just process your thoughts. It's okay if you're one of those people that don't like messing up their books. You kind of got to get out of that for poetry. I think it's very effective to annotate and write out what your thoughts are, what you are struggling to understand, what you're questioning within a poem. Especially starting out, you have to do that. An example that I have is from a poetry collection that I read recently, Savannah Brown, from her collection Sweet Dark, and the poem is Autopsy, Performed Gasping. So you'll see it on the screen, I'll put it up. But basically she says, the daisies make space for us like a womb, and I keep telling you I could fall asleep. What that means is I feel safe enough to lie belly up. What that means is this is unusual. And as you can see, I just said connecting two ideas and realizing how strange it is, but making sense of it equals poetry. Boom. That's just what I was thinking. I thought that stanza and those lines were a good example of using images to connect unusual things but make sense of them in a way. So my last and final tip for you is to read intentionally. Now, this may seem kind of like obvious, but I want you to sit and be with the poem, okay? I feel like a lot of times, especially if you're used to reading like fiction and nonfiction, we read at a certain pace, and when we get into that rhythm, it's like we could fly through pages. No, poetry collections are usually way shorter for the most part, especially if you read more literary poets like Mary Oliver, Sylvia Plath, Robert Frost, Oliver's poetry collection. And look how skinny it is, okay? In total, it is 77 pages. This is purposeful. You are supposed to read a poem and sit with it. Read it over and over. There's nothing wrong with that. And in a way, you'll see that you are discovering new things about the poem that you might not have gotten upon first reading it and trying to get to the next one. Read very intentionally with poems. Sit and let the words marinate, let them cook down, let you digest them. And especially with building upon these tips, I think that will really help you understand poetry, especially if there are lines that you are just in love with and you highlight and underline and annotate them, and then you just keep going back to them. And in a way, you'll see that poetry is discovering. It is a verb. It is actively going forward and actively going in. Guys, I sound like I'm making like no sense when I'm talking, but if you or like the people out there who have read a lot of poetry and you just so happen to be reading this video, you'll know exactly what I mean. And to me, that's what's beautiful about poetry, is you can really always take so much from it every single time you read it. Another tip within the read intentionally tip is obviously do not read poetry that you do not like. I tend to appreciate more free verse poems. I like poems that have like lyricism to them, but I'm not a fan of overly rhymey poems. Some people love poetry like that. Some people love narrative poems that tell stories. Some people love odes and songs and sonnets. I just personally tend to read more free verse poetry. So as you read more poetry collections, you'll know which types of poems you like to read, and then you can discover your favorite poets that way by tapping into those specific subsets of poetry, subdivisions of poetry. And if you want to get into poetry but you don't want to invest in actually buying collections before you hone in on these skills that I'm presenting to you, I think it's a really good idea to go to like the Poetry Foundation website. You can just search poems on there and you can read them for free. They're online, and sometimes these poems are like more academic poems that are taught in school, and then you can find other people analyzing them and then just cross-reference what you got from the poem. Don't forget to have fun with poetry. People tend to view poetry as a super serious, like I was saying before, super serious, very pretentious genre of literature, and I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I think poetry is accessible for everyone, especially those willing and eager to make an effort to understand it. And I think it is one of the most rewarding genres of literature. I don't know, I could be a little biased, but I just feel as though everyone should really give poetry a chance. These are just very simple tips, or overwhelm you with super literary terms and analysis and blah, 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 because I don't think that's necessary for the average reader who just wants to sit with the poetry collection and get lost in it. And yeah, that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed these.
Okay. So hopefully you found this useful, because it comes from a poet. She herself writes poetry, which is great tips from her. I personally like when you read poetry, you read it with open mind. Can you tell me why would that be crucial? Just write down in the chat box. Why do you think this is crucial, to have an open mind? Very good reason here. What is it? Why do you need to have an open mind when you read poetry? Ahmed, can you share your thoughts? Ahmed, Muhammad, Jawad, Yasser. Anyone? Excellent. Thank you, Yasser. You're absolutely correct. So you need to be an open mind, because everyone can interpret the message in a different way. And a good thing is everyone could be correct. My interpretation could be correct, your interpretation could be correct, because only the poet knows exactly what they write for, what is their exact message. And this is just for understanding and for appreciating the work by the poet. And I here just want to share with you the analysis of the poem Stolen Rivers. So the parts, I know that you are good students and you can definitely continue working on the activity. This is an activity for you before the exam, and this is to get your hands wet, to realize how you will be doing this. So if you think about it, the Stolen River is absolutely showing the the main purpose or the message is it's an attribute dedicated to the singer from Zimbabwe. And this guy used to speak about the agony of Africa and what happened, and the stolen land and the stolen richness of Africa. This guy also reveals a political point of view against politics in general, colonizations and racism. It's also very related to the topics that the singer used to think about and sing and use in his verses and his songs. And also, as you can see, the theme of the poem shows the weight of a troubled history of oppression. Are you familiar with Nelson Mandela and the people in Africa? I think that would give historical depth to the poem. When there is agony and there is suffering for the rights of the Black people at the time. And not only the Black people, but it is also about the occupied countries and the occupied lands and territories, which we still have certain areas in the world up till our time today. Still have countries are suffering from occupation. So you can see that this poem is the theme or the message could be applicable to different situations. So in this context, I would like you to realize that the message, the wording, the paraphrasing you are going to write, to paraphrase, to analyze, to understand, and to go deeper in this poem can be applicable to any other poem related to the same context. And the good thing is, it's not necessarily against the occupation in its own meaning, but it is also against any type of oppression. So the tone, some of you mentioned it's sad or tone to ask for revenge. And I mentioned that revenge always somehow accompanied with violence. But let's say the author here or the poet never ask for violence, but he's probably has mixed feelings, which exactly happened with you. So the poet is successful that some of you mentioned it is sad, some of you mentioned it's revenge. So there is a mixed feeling here, and it is a celebration and a cry for the current trouble of South Africa. So it could be reflecting to what is happening in South Africa these days in our modern time. We still see or hear of oppression against the Black people in South Africa, similar to the oppression that was caused by the invaders, the occupation, the time of Africa at that time. So the poem represents life in South Africa well, because the citizens have a sense of renewed hope. So guess what? We still have hope referred to hope in the poem, but yet they live in a dominating shadow of their past. So there is symbolism also here. I highlighted the important points here with the yellow color to make you pay attention to the symbols, the tone, the theme, and so on and so forth. We can notice the use of similes and the metaphors in the stolen rivers, starting from like forest fires, like haunted children. If you remember the ones here, like forest fires, like haunted children. So there is a simile here because he uses the device. So the main image the poet concentrated on is the most emotional, the deception of South Africa's riches pouring out of the singer's mouth as he sings. Remember when we talked about, can we have a river coming out of our mouth when we speak? It never happens, but this is a metaphor, another metaphor showing that the words flow is exactly similar to the river that is flowing from the singer's mouth. From this act, there is a celebration, right? The last four lines illustrate even a performance of this level is not enough to alleviate the present horrors of the country. It's nothing compared to what they have been suffering from and until now. So the format, also you need to talk about the form of the style of the poem. As you can see, it's all one stanza here. So it's formed of one stanza like a river. So remember when we talked about the shape poems, the poem takes the shape of what you are talking about. Remember the star, my cat, the triangle, whatever, any of those can take the shape of what you are talking about. So the fact that we have one stanza in the format of a wave, if you look at it, it's like a wave, right? Like a wave, as if the river water is waving here in one stanza. So the poet deliberately uses this context to match with the poem. There are also lots of punctuation. You can also talk about that in your analysis. Look at the punctuation here, the two columns, the commas, the question mark, the exclamation mark, the semicolon. All of these would be used to highlight the flow of the poem. The punctuation is needed for readers to stop and to consider the weight of the phrases. So remember always that everything you use here in your writing concerning the form, the number of lines, the rhythm, even what is the type of the music in the poem? Is it like the drum? Bum, bum, bum. How it is done. The line breaks seem natural and almost as if the lines were written spontaneously in like in a kind of inspiration. However, with the consciousness, the effectiveness of the language, the poet here edited the poem as well, because we need to make sure that the spelling is okay and there are no mistakes. However, you will see in one of the poems, the poet deliberately writes the word in a different way because of a purpose. There is a purpose. You will see it later on, maybe in the text, the end of unit test, or we will discuss it later on. So this is to show you the purpose of the writer. So the trick that the poets often say here is to make a poem seem like it was written easily. You just don't feel that he was like, reviewing and he was editing and thinking to put a column here or to put an exclamation mark here and so on. So you don't feel that. I'm sure when I first read it to you at the beginning of the session, you didn't feel there is anything you need to stop at. It's the flow goes as if it's one of the waves of the river. So I personally believe that the poem achieved this goal and also achieved this feeling with us. All of us, we got this feeling deep down. The emotional tribute to South African musician and hero. This poem bursts with pathos and the imagery and effective use of the poetic devices here. To be honest, the Stolen Rivers impacts a reader to a great degree. It is a fine addition to African literature that will be sure to be anthologized and treasures for years to come. And you can definitely confirm the few endings here, the few lines to end it. When he says that the Africa moved its golden bones, shook off its heavy chains, and danced again. That night I thought, if only love could purchase bread, Africans would not be hungry. If I want to remove this line and stop at danced again, these lines here, the ones I underlined, what can you tell me about this figure? You can write in the chat box. What can you tell me about these underlined lines in here? Can you write in the chat box what you feel and what kind of figures here and what is the effect of using this figure on you as a reader? I'm gonna copy it, stop sharing, and put it here for everyone. So what do you think about these few lines? You can interpret this in the chat box. You can tell me what figure of a speech did the writer use in here. Look at that. Africa moved its golden bones, shook off its heavy chains, and danced again. Think about it. Can Africa dance? Can Africa move the chains? Can Africa throw the chains? So I want you please to write what kind of metaphor is this and how did it make you feel? We have few minutes to close the session and I wanted to close it with a learning that you can take with you and also an appreciation, how you felt it, how you liked the simile or the metaphor. What kind of metaphor is here? Remember when we talked about the daffodils? Please write your responses in the chat box. Bravo, Yasser. Yasser, you're active today. Thank you. You will get a grade for class participation, definitely. Yes, Yasser, maybe it means they were able to overcome the oppression and live again. Absolutely, I like that. Thank you. This is the message that the writer wanted to give you through those lines. Can I ask you, other members in the class, like Muhammad and Jawad and Ahmed, do you think this closing is it positive? Is it negative? What would it convey? What would it give you, like the mood, the tone, Can you tell me something related to the tone and the mode of the poet here? Hope. Yes, Jawad, absolutely. It gives hope here. So there is no revenge, there is no violence, but there is a quest for hope. And there is a determination. There is a determination that Africa will come back to positivity. Yes, absolutely. Now, I wonder if Muhammad, can you tell me what is the name of the metaphor here? When the poet compares Africa to a girl dancing, what do you think this metaphor is? What do we call it? Remember, the daffodils were dancing. Remember, it's starting with P. So what is the metaphor here? Muhammad, do you know? Okay, in case you just forget, it's personification. Personification. Remember when we talked about any item or any like non-living thing or an animal or anything that is having the traits of human beings, we call it personification. If remember when we said the piece of the cake was talking to me, no piece of cake would talk to people, but this is kind of personification. Okay, so this is how to appreciate poetry, and this is how you need to analyze. This is what you will get in on Sunday. You will have a end of unit test. This way we ended unit 1, which is about poetry. I was asked by Dr. Hussein to confirm with you if is it okay to have more hours on one of the days, like Monday or Tuesday, and we can keep it to 2 hours. Just let me know if that is possible or not. And I just wanted to let him know, and you can just write in the chat box if it is okay or not, or you can speak up. Let me stop the recording now.